What book did you read in school that you would never want your child to read? My fifth grade teacher read the Stephen King short story Survival Type to the Kell. For those who haven't read, the narrator, Mick, is a drug smuggler who crash lands his plane on a deserted island. He ends up doing all the heroin he recovered from the crash and cannibalizes himself. We didn't know at the time our teacher had early onset dementia. I'm confused. What does dementia have to do with reading out a dark short story to the class? I thought the disease had more to do with short-term memory deterioration in the early stages, and when the disease gets bad enough to significantly impair judgment, it should be impossible to even functionally teach a class in the first place. A Day No Pigs Would Die was pretty rough in 6th grade. Basically, Charlotte's Web with hauntingly graphic depictions of animal husbandry and slaughter. I don't remember getting a lot of value out of it at 11 years old, just pig blood-soaked nightmares. I grew up loving that book being read to me before bed when visited my grandmother. She grew up on a farm, and I like to imagine I was getting some farm life experience from the book. It's a pretty great book except the end bit, which is mostly just sad, but maybe it depends on the kid. Dianetics or Anything Else by L. Ron Hubbard. Edited to explain why Dianetics was read in school. I was a junior in high school. Our AP World History teacher assigned us a project to research a world religion outside of the big three. Half of the students chose Buddhism, a few chose Hinduism, a few Taoism, a few LDS, etc. But this was 0506, and the Trapped in the Closet episode of South Park had just come out. Having never before heard of Scientology, I had to know if the episode was accurate. I briefly worked for those people at Gold Base in Hemet, and they gave me a book called The Importance of Work, and you couldn't get through the first half page. I've challenged many. It's just drivel, a run-on sentence, and you completely zone out and don't know what you've read. Complete crap that should never have made it to production. A Day No Pigs Would Die. I read it in the 7th grade, and it still affects me in my mid-30s. Life is already sad enough. That book ed me up when I was 12. I used to devour books. It was a problem. I would read when I was supposed to be doing other things, but after I finished that book, I didn't pick up another for weeks. Also, not too long after reading that book, I learned that lard is pig fat. There's a part in the book where the farmer is trying to get two pigs to mate, and it describes how the farmer used lard to lube up the female pig so the male pig would have an easier time. So the one pig ed the other pig with dead pig as lube. That really ed me up. I recall being in 6th grade and a fellow student writing a book report on an erotic novel she had read about an extremely overweight man collapsing on a hooker while mid-intercourse, and she rips off his jaw and uses it to sever off one of his limbs and get out from under him. I remember being 13 years old and thinking, this is pretty ed up for a 13-year-old. I had a good friend at 13 who was very into Stephen King and would tell me graphic descriptions of effed up stuff from his books. I think she might have made some of her own up too. We were very edgy lol. I imagine that your classmate was also trying to shock people and get a reaction. Mission accomplished. Maybe this isn't the question, but I read A Child Called It as an elementary-aged child. I bought it at the school's Scholastic Book Fair and was maybe 9 years old. Why on earth they thought that was an appropriate book for small children to be purchasing and reading, I will never know. The 90s were a trip. I'm so happy I read that book at the young age that I did, regardless of the veracity of the author's account. Prior to reading A Child Called It, I wasn't fully aware that loving one's child was not some imperative for all parents. It helped me conceptualize my own relationship with my parents and provided the necessary perspective to recognize that many of my peers may be victims of narcissistic abuse to varying degrees. The Kite Runner. My dad saw me pick that up at a bookstore when I was in the 7th grade, and he said no, I wasn't allowed to read that till I got older. Me being the rebellious little I was, convinced my friend to buy it, and we took turns reading it. Yeah, that book is not for kids. I learned some things that day. I also read that in 7th grade, except it was because I was in the advanced reading group, so we had to read something more advanced than The Outsiders, which the rest of the school read in 7th grade. Not only are there some very adult situations in that book, but 7th grade was just too young to grasp the concepts that book was trying to showcase. Not to mention, without some historical context, it's hard to understand what's happening in the story. Now, when I read it in high school, it was much easier to understand and I appreciated it much, much more. Fantastic book. just maybe not for a 12-year-old. I think all of Khaled Hosseini's books are good for high school level. You're old enough to understand and get what the author is showing. Read Kite Runner in high school, and it was definitely the most impactful book I read in school. Read A Thousand Splendid Suns right after undergrad, and it was just as good but almost more heartbreaking in how it showed the generational impact. Actually just finished and the mountains echoed. That one is a little different in that it's from the perspective of 5-6 different characters that are all somewhat interrelated. Still very good, and each little short story within the overall story is pretty heartbreaking, especially Abdullah's and Nabi's. We had to watch that movie in my theology class in high school for some reason. We would lose a lot of points on the assignment if we left for the essay scenes. I hated it. I saw the point in the movie, but I would prefer not to watch that, or at least have permission to leave and just get told what happens. If I had a kid, I would let them read it. My parents let me read anything, even if it wasn't age appropriate, but if they knew what it was, they would have a conversation with me about it before, during, and after I was reading it. I would try and do the same thing. My parents always knew what I was reading, because they would ask, and they would look up the book so they could discuss it with me, and sometimes read it themselves if they thought it was interesting. I know it's weak, but the ending to Of Mice and Men really messed up my 13-year-old brain. My English class read it together, taking it in turns to read aloud when I was 16, and it was a lovely experience. We hated it at first, and then by the end we were invested, and a bunch of people cried, including the cool girls who usually sat at the back giggling. My friends and I were the twats who read ahead and knew the ending. We didn't spoil, but we were smug about knowing what was coming. Probably a bit heavy for a 13 years old though. We read the stage version at my high school, not as homework, but as a sort of table read where we went around the classroom with everyone taking a turn to read lines. I don't think I'd ever seen the entire class so invested in something. Not just kids approaching my own level of nerdiness, but everyone, even the troublemakers and barely literate kids. It kinda blew my friggin' mind. And then, when we finished the story over the course of a few classes, I think we all suffered together through the ending. Trauma bonding, yay! Honestly, that book was probably the only worthwhile book in our curriculum, as far as I can remember. The Scarlet Letter that was a grind. I love to read, but I wanted to claw my eyes out so I could stop reading it. I feel there are a lot of books that are required reads in H's that, while not age inappropriate for their content, they are age inappropriate in regards to life experience. Scarlet Letter is one. How can H's appreciate it when the majority will not have had anything related to this story happen to them in life? Same with The Great Gatsby. They are stories written for adults that are being forced upon H's and middle school students. Not saying that H's shouldn't read these books, just only if they're interested. I read The Scarlet Letter in high school too, and I don't remember how I felt about it then, but I recently picked it up in a book haul as an adult, and I finished reading it like 2 weeks ago, and it was actually pretty good. The best way I can describe it is that it reads kind of like poetry. It's definitely a very particular style of writing, and it definitely wouldn't be for everyone, and reading it as a teenager would probably be a real struggle, especially if you were someone who wasn't already an avid reader. I think the problem with a lot of books that are standard assigned reading in school is that their target audience when they were written is not high school-aged teenagers. Where the Red Fern Grows. I wept like a baby when I read that book. I don't want to subject my little one, who loves dogs, to that heartbreak. My middle school kept moving up what year read that book, so my class were the lucky ones that had to read the damn book 3 years in a row, 6th, 8th, I think, plus go see the play twice. Once was traumatizing enough. I have no idea why they didn't just have us skip it instead of going through it again like none of us had read it before. I remember having to be the one to read the scene out loud the second go around when I knew full well what was coming and nearly had a panic attack as I did. It and all of the other multitudes of books they had us read about dogs that are abused and had gruesome deaths gave me nightmares for years. The ending still sometimes pops into my mind, and I would love to scrub the whole thing from my brain. There are so many books I read skimmed in school that I hated because they were so boring to a teenager. The Great Gatsby or Pride and Prejudice may be classic books to read as an adult, but I just didn't care at the time. I went to school in Baltimore and we did a whole unit on Edgar Allan Poe. It was great. Want teens to engage with a story? Have them read the tale of a murderer slowly going mad because he thinks he can still hear the beating heart of his victim under the floorboards. While we're at it, throw in some other genres besides basic fiction. You know who would have gotten me engaged as a student? J.R.R. Tolkien, Robert Heinlein, Isaac Asimov, or Agatha Christie. Give me more classic science fiction. I was dismayed that I didn't even know who Asimov, Heinlein, or even Agatha Christie was until I was in college. Maryland native here, and Poe is one of my favorite writers. Murder at Rue Morgue is controversial. One college professor stated very clearly that in literary circles, we do not talk about the orangutan is almost unanimously accepted, but my personal faves are Mask of the Red Death, Cask of Amontillado, For the Love of God, Montresor, Yes, For the Love of God, and Black Cat. Jane Austen is actually easier to read as long as you keep in mind that her books were never meant to be read at face value. She was a total smartass whose works are extremely critical of the social conventions of her day. Take the intro to Pride and Prejudice at face value. You'd think she's actually advocating for marrying a rich guy just because he's rich. But reread it with a sarcastic tone in mind, and it totally changes the meaning. It is a truth universally acknowledged that a single man in possession of a good fortune must be in want of a wife. She's poking fun, criticizing the marriage market and lack of opportunities for women in all her novels. Hear me out, this is a weird take, Cyrano de Bergerac. Not because it isn't a good story, it is, but because I think high school boys get the wrong message from it, and it fuels this incel, neckbeard fantasy of I'm truly special, and I will pursue this woman until she realizes how special I am. She only likes that other guy because he's cute. It definitely isn't that I'm in whole. I don't think that's healthy for them. I think a lot of them don't get that it's satire because it's in Middle English. I'm not saying they can't read it, but it shouldn't be required as part of the curriculum either. It was for me at least. Everyone's saying none because of current issues, and it's the trendy thing to do, but I'll answer truthfully. I wouldn't want my kids to read The Kite Runner, not until they were old enough to start to understand how the real world is. I'd also want them to understand the rough history of the conflict and region before reading it. Honorable mentions, The Road by Cormac McCarthy, for obvious reasons. Watched the movie when I was in like 6th grade, and if you've seen it or read the book, you know the scenes that stuck with me. Read the book when I was older and enjoyed it, but it's not for children. Rat Life by Ted Arnold. Read it in 8th grade. It was appropriate at that time, but still some things stuck with me. I wouldn't want my kids to read it before the age that I did. Something that stuck with me from this book, main character walking down a highway. A stray puppy is on the other side, sees the main character and starts running to him all excited. Dog gets his back leg smashed by a semi. Main character s it with a rock to put it out of its misery. That haunted me, but also exposed me to mercying severely injured animals. Being exposed to it at a younger age prepared me for the real world, where I've had to do it a handful of times. A lot of people confusing censorship with I don't want my kid to read that steaming pile of garbage. For me, it was beloved. There's also books I'd argue I wouldn't want my child reading when she's a child. So many great pieces of literature are foisted on kids the second they ought to be able to understand the vocabulary, but why before they could be expected to connect to the content of the story? I know of too many people who absolutely hate some of the most amazing stories of all time just because they were forced to read them at an age in which they have none of the context from personal experience that you'd need to emotionally connect with the story and truly understand it. Everyone is hopping on the censorship thing cause it's a nice morally upstanding answer, but it would be more interesting if people had actual answers. When I was in like 5th grade, I found a book called Peaches, I think. Or maybe the girl was named Peach, I don't know. It looked like a typical YA book by the cover, but about halfway through the girl gets raped by a friend and she blames herself and a lot of confusing things happen. I wasn't ready to read that. I read another book about a girl that gets HIV the first time she has and then she dies. The end of the book mentioned guys with HIV having to put tampons in their butts because they were bleeding to death from AIDS. Something like that. I think I read that in like 5th grade. It was purely propaganda and I wouldn't want my kid to read that at any point. I would want both books to be available to them, of course, but I would give them the Cliff's Notes. I read a book about King Arthur. I think it was just called Arthur the King. I enjoyed royalty, knights, and historical fiction, so it looked like a great pick for me for this book project. It was in my teacher's classroom on a list of approved options. Y'all, I was not ready for the amount of rape and sodomy in there. It was absurd. I think the book was actually meant to be an erotic novel. It's the only reason I can think of for that much adult content. I'm positive the teacher had never read it herself. I'm all for kids being exposed to a variety of topics, and teens can be exposed to wallity, and I was 16 or 17 at the time. But this was just beyond anything. I don't want any kids reading Shakespeare. I want kids experiencing Shakespeare. Small performances in the CL have props and stuff to toss around as everyone takes a shot at each role. You're going to have at least one kid who realizes they can make some music to go along with the verses, put on a tiny show. Talk about the weird history, culture, and lore that is vital to each play and sonnet. Yes, I do think the bard has spent more than enough time in the spotlight and could move aside for other script and verse. But the way I was taught, Shakespeareing ruined what could have been a wealth of experience. He's not supposed to be read monotone like from someone at the front of the class or by yourself as homework. Gone with the Wind. Not because it's offensive or because it has rape scenes that portray the main character as liking them. It does, or because it depicts slavery from the wrong side of history. It definitely does. No, because it's a 900-plus page book that ends and begins without really doing anything, and it doesn't even attempt to show one battle of the Civil War. It's basically waiting for Godot, but instead of God, it's a prissy southerner who never loved the main character anyways, while the real lover has to rape her to show how much he loves her. It's utter trash. I'm of the controversial opinion that not many things are truly inappropriate for children if they're capable of actually grasping the subject matter. But for me, there is one thing I feel was genuinely not appropriate and that I regret exposing myself to: A Million Little Pieces by James Frey. In 7th grade, I stole that book from my parents' room. The cover was cool and I loved reading edgy yuff fiction. And I absolutely didn't need to be consuming that novel as a 12-year-old. I was easily old enough to grasp drug abuse and rape, but it was just a inglot. I don't recall the experience very fondly. Heart of Darkness. It's just so boring and a waste of hours of my life. The worst part is it has the potential to be exciting and interesting. Cannibals and wild animal attacks. But the goddamn main character is more focused on how many bolts and nuts he needs to fix his damn boat. I have a copy of it somewhere. It's a very short book. I took it with me on my commute one morning, and since it was so short, I brought a second book with me just in case I finished it before I got home and had nothing to read. I read the first page. As I turned to the second page, I realized I had absolutely no idea what happened on the first page, so I went back and read it again. Repeat a few times. Somehow the words just would not stick in my head. I was quickly very glad I'd brought a second book with me that day. Advanced Electronics and Electrical Systems Theory and Application. There are countless chapters in that book that I didn't even read in trade school. About 5 chapters in that book applied to my career unless you're trying to design infrastructure or further your education as an engineer. You will zone out and may lose your passion if you're overwhelmed with too much information. Use 30% of book material and 70% hands-on. Field experience will make understanding that book much more palatable. As a fledgling who had never held a set of pliers or screwdriver, you'll lose them to the void. I hear everyone's good intentions when they say we shouldn't restrict or ban books. You all have the right spirit, but consider that parents are supposed to provide guidance to their kids and ensure that the information they're exposed to can be appreciated appropriately and with context. Easing children's exposure to certain topics is responsible parenting. If you need a comparison, think about TV and movies. We don't typically have children watch Schindler's List, Requiem for a Dream, or American History X until they're ready. Also consider that TV and movies are most often watched in a group setting where adults can talk about what's happening with the kid as they're watching, but school books are most often read by kids on their own and then only discussed in KEL. Adults have a responsibility to teach responsibly. No subjects or books should be banned, but appropriate guidance is required. As someone whose mind visualizes everything I read and hear, it was difficult and traumatizing to read some of the books I was asked to read in school. Due to those books, rather than appreciate the lessons the school was trying to teach me, I began to become depressed and thought of reading as a traumatizing experience. I no longer think so. I love reading. I read with my kid every night, but I would not want her reading Things Fall Apart, Night, or The Kite Runner before high school. The Bluest Eye, at least, not without a severe trigger warning for child molestation and abuse. Whoa! I'm reading it right now for AP Literature, was given zero warning other than it being depressing by my teacher, and as a victim of youthful assault, I have to endlessly put it down. I think it's a good book to read, as it shows a realistic view of what it was like to be a POC in the 1960s, but it definitely should not be required in the curriculum and teachers should educate and warn their students more. I can't imagine my sister reading this in a few years. I read Maxime Chatham's Malefices in middle school. It was a very thrilling book, however. In one chapter, it had a very vivid depiction of the serialer shoving a hot metal rod inside a woman's vagina and injecting her with a chemical to melt her insides while she was alive and conscious. Screaming. The pain made her face stay in a screaming expression even post-mortem. That stayed with me for a while. Definitely not appropriate for a child. I remember reading a story in elementary school, and it was so sad that I skipped school when I knew we were finishing the story the next day. I don't remember the name of it, but the story was about orphans getting on a train during the Industrial Revolution and making stops in each city to be potentially adopted. The main character was older than most of the kids and thought he or she, I don't remember, was going on a train ride and that her parents were going to pick them up at the end. I knew those parents weren't going to be there at the end, and it was so sad. So I told my parents I couldn't go to school the next day because I was so distraught. Instead of answering this, I'm going to list one book that after reading, changed me for good. Ishmael by Daniel Quinn. From Wiki, Ishmael is a 1992 philosophical novel by Daniel Quinn. The novel examines the hidden cultural biases driving modern civilization and explores themes of ethics, sustainability, and global catastrophe. Largely framed as a Socratic conversation between two characters, one Ishmael aims to expose that several widely accepted assumptions of modern society, such as human supremacy, are actually cultural myths that produce catastrophic consequences for humankind and the environment. Maybe the Belgariad series? It reads as a wholesome adventure at first, but I just reread it last month. The bear dude, Barak, rapes his wife but is presented in a charitable light. Women, with a few exceptions, are portrayed as being spiteful just to keep the men on their toes at a game. Prone to fits of rage because women, etc. Defiantly a product of its times, but hasn't aged well. There's also the main characters being in a very unhealthy abusive relationship, played for laughs because Sinedra, the wife, is the one doing the emotional abuse. Also racism, but I don't feel it's as bad as in real life due to the nature of the world. Still problematic though. Books I wouldn't want my children to read in general, like regardless of their age, Great Expectations. Not only was it about as thick or thicker than most textbooks I had in high school, but it was also real old-time English which made it hard to follow and hard to get into. Going to have to agree with a lot of other comments and say Shakespeare for various reasons. I hated poetry. It's meant to be acted, not read, etc. The road was pretty messed up. Lord of the Flies become my takeaway was that British kids are weird. There are certain banned books I would strongly not recommend, like those with rape. But there are banned books I would recommend like 1984, Brave New World, Fahrenheit 451 become those dystopia are real problems, possibilities for today's world. Then for books that I wouldn't want young children to read would be any that talk about or Yule themes, or like kinda messed up ing happens like in Of Mice and Men Become I would want them to be mature enough to understand it better.